I am delighted to be here. Jobs Francis Turner held in his first 6 months in Detroit, 4. Jobs willfully abandoned, 1.5. Rooms rented, 1/2. Money sent to his wife Viola, $7. Alcohol consumed, many paychecks worth. Women slept with, 1. Number of times he slept with her, he stopped counting. Here's the truth about self-discovery. It is never without costs, not now in the age of create-your-own college majors, the Peace Corps and yoga retreats, and definitely not during World War II for a young Black father newly migrated to a strange city. On the first freezing day in October, Francis discovered that the back of the bar on Bourbon had poor insulation. The patrons basked in warmth, but even Clydell's sizzling griddle could not prevent the kitchen from slipping into the 30s. On Clydell's advice, Francis spent the small amount of money he'd saved on a heavier coat to wear throughout his shift. No use. Whenever he pulled his hands out of the dishwasher, his knuckles ached like he had a bad case of early onset arthritis. He started spiking his coffee with bourbon to stay warm. Soon enough, he called Clydell a stingy, pock-faced, crooked nigger under his breath, too loud, alas, and got the boot. It was a milestone. He'd never given words like that a go out of his own mouth, not directed at someone in particular. Never mind that Clydell's face wasn't marred by pocks as much as heavily freckled, or that Francis hadn't quite cussed the man to his face. He felt one step closer to holding his own up here where men were crooked but pretended to be magnanimous. That feeling lasted until rent on his half room was due. To say that Francis slept with Odella Withers, the mistress of his boarding house to secure free housing, would not be accurate. He might have slept with her sooner had he seen her for longer than the moment when she handed over his bedding each night. Lonely as he was, Francis might have slept with one of the prostitutes he often saw smoking cigarettes and laughing alongside men in Paradise Valley bars. Had he thought he could afford one, Odella Withers had a wide mouth, very straight, square teeth, and bright pink gums. A mouth that made her look happier than Francis thought she was. Brown skin, not as dark as Viola's, but close. Francis Turner had a predilection for darker women. Perhaps it was a subconscious effort to prevent potential offspring from defecting to white. Or maybe it was because his own mother had been darker than his ill-fated beige father. Francis would sit in the armchair across from Odella in the boarding house's miserable little parlor and tell her all about his long day looking for work, how he'd hitched a ride down to River Rouge to see about work, only to have slots for the Black men snapped up before he arrived, how he was in line to see about work at a foundry when an ambulance pulled up and word spread that a man had been nearly cooked alive. He told her about his week and a half working as a runner at the salt mine, how it reminded him of the time he traveled down to the Gulf with Reverend Tufts for a revival and felt his lungs fill with salty sea air miles before they got close enough to see the coast. He didn't tell her that he'd quit the salt mines because, sea air notwithstanding, he could not bear to be so far underground, the white walls dwarfing him, his own shadow a stranger as he hunched over and shuttled carts of supplies to white men, similar to how he imagined Hebrew slaves carting stone at Egyptian quarries. Few people think about the individual lives lost to make something huge, but Francis Turner thought about it often, had thought about it since the first time he read Exodus as a child. He feared he'd died in that dried-up ocean cave, either from a blast gone wrong or plain old sun-starved misery. He found Odella reasonably versed in the Bible, and she knew about the goings-on both overseas and in Detroit, thanks to her fondness for the radio. The Fibber McGee and Molly show had just come on the evening Francis decided to sit directly next to Odella and see what that wide mouth felt like pressed up against his own. They were in her little apartment downstairs with its banging radiator by the time the show's ham-fisted Johnson Wax commercial ended. Odella was the second woman Francis had ever slept with, and he was grateful for the experience, adultery be damned. So grateful, he repeated it as the act as often as she let him. Sleeping with her was not enough to absolve him of his rental obligations. Everybody's got to pay rent, soldier, Odella said one morning. even a body like yours. They drunk half a pint of cheap bourbon the night before, and Odella stood in an ivory slip in front of her kitchenette, making a water and baking soda concoction for their hangovers. The thermostat outside read in the 20s, but Odella's basement apartment was always steamy, which she claimed was good for the lungs and bad for her hair. She liked to call Francis a soldier, and Francis never could decide whether she meant to make him feel brave or like a coward. She didn't ask him about back home, and he did not ask how she came to rent out a big old house by herself. He guessed her to be in her late 30s, but that guess was predicated only upon the way the skin between her breasts folded like a tiny accordion when she put them in a brassiere. The first job Odella found Francis involved painting houses with an outfit run by the same man who had painted the boarding house years before. This job Francis enjoyed. He had some skill in painting, thanks to summers spent touching up the church back home, and he got an opportunity to see more of the city than bus and streetcar fare could afford him. He tracked the pockets in neighborhoods where Negroes were living, and those where they seemed to have the best chance of encroaching. Out near 8 Mile in Wyoming, country life claimed its last foothold, but as much as a small farm and a modest house appealed to him, Francis knew Detroit was not the place for it. While outhouses and water pumps were ubiquitous back home, up here they heralded dire straits. He rode in the back of the truck and watched junk collectors traverse Black Bottom, their rickety carts overloaded with treasure scavenged from the many garbage piles that lined the back streets. 40 years later, he would think of these men when scrappers descended on his own neighborhood. He would imagine them running around the east side at night, placing the bits of metal they pried off of houses into the same rudimentary carts. The second job Odella found him was the most Jim Crow job in all of Detroit, or so Francis thought. Odella knew a few members of the Urban League who knew a member of the Nasarima Club, a social club for Negroes with status. American spelled backwards, she told him. Francis found this foreboding. The Nasarima man hired all of the caretakers for the cars that executives at a certain major manufacturer drove to work each day. They switched to defense building before the war, yet their own cars still received special attention. The company preferred Negroes with genteel mannerisms to serve the executives, but they settled for those with light skin and a pinch. Francis greeted the bosses when they came to work, washed and serviced the cars as needed, and drove them back out front when summoned. A stable boy for 20th century horses, a job Francis Turner was born to lose. Thank you.